Ross Ulbricht is serving a double life sentence without parole for all nonviolent charges for creating a website. Please help free this peaceful man. Go to freeross.org and sign and share the petition.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dissecting Liberty podcast. My name is LibertyZero. You can call me Zero. And I'm joined by my co-host, Cottonarchist, Liberty
Hello.
Cotton. And today we're going to be talking about private property and why that's so important, and how really it's the foundation of libertarianism. Are you ready, Cotton?
Absolutely.
All right, let's get into it. So first, I want to start with a quote from Frederick Bastiat in his book, The Law. And in it, he says, "Man can only derive life and enjoyment from a perpetual search and appropriation, that is, from a perpetual application of his faculties to objects or from labor. This is the origin of property." From there, we'll go on to John Locke, and in his second treatise of government, John Locke, he talks about how God gave the earth to man in common, and nothing originated as private property. Obviously, he's coming at this from a creationist Christian worldview, and so he says that the earth's resources, for them to be of use, there must be a way to appropriate them. And so in his effort to justify and explain private property, he starts with the fact that man owns his own body, right? And as an extension of that, his labor and the work of his hands are his. Now, when he takes something from the state of nature, takes a physical object from the state of nature, and he mixes it with his labor, that becomes his property. He uses an example of a man gathering acorns, and he asks the question, when are those acorns his? Is it when they're eaten by him? Is it when they're prepared by him, when he takes them home? And what he finds is that it's the labor is what makes it distinct from acorns in the natural state, being common to everyone. And he's thought to be the first philosopher to identify labor as the critical distinction for private property. Quoting from the 5th chapter of his second treatise, he says, God gave the world to men in common, but since he gave it to them for their benefit, in the greatest conveniences of life they were capable to draw from it, it cannot be supposed he meant it should always remain common and uncultivated. So he's saying that God wanted us to take the earth and develop it and use it to our
it was God's gift to us so that we could live prosperously.
Correct. So acquiring property for yourself is how you survive. Land and resources not being utilized does not further the human race. In Human Action, Ludwig von Mises states, ownership means the full control of the services that can be derived from a good. I would like to add that, restated, ownership allows you to exclude others from what can be derived from a good. And I say this because that's really the point of private property, and that's what differentiates it from something like public property or whatever, right? So we've discussed what private property is. Now we need to discuss what limits there are. And really, that's property is a physical object. It's tangible. In their article on property and exploitation, Hans Hermann Hoppe and Walter Block explained why property rights extend only to physical objects, but not over to the value of those objects. Because the argument can be made that you own the financial value of your object, but in this article they say that you cannot have, or you have a right to expect others to not physically damage your property, but you don't have a claim over the value. So I quote from the article, while every person can, in principle, have control over whether or not his actions cause the physical attributes of other person's property to change, control over whether or not his actions affect the value of other people's property rests with other people and their evaluations. Consequently, it would be impossible to know in advance if one's planned actions were permitted or not. One would have to interrogate the entire population to make sure that one's planned actions would not impair the value of anybody else's property. As well, one would have to reach a universal agreement on who is permitted to do what with which goods. Mankind would long be dead before this was ever accomplished. Hence, the theory breaks down as non-operational.
Yeah, we can do that. No problem.
Right. So, moving on to intellectual property, simply put, you cannot lay claim to ideas. You may protect physical documentation or manifestations of your ideas, but you cannot prevent others from having the same idea as you. And so by extension, you cannot keep others from copying your ideas. I feel like that's pretty straightforward. So in summary, you cannot lay claim to the value of your property, and you cannot, physical property is not a legitimate form of property. Intellectual property is not a legitimate form of property.
Yeah,
so,
I have something to that I can add.
Go ahead.
I know somebody that owns a business, and the business is mainly dealing with a specific type of software that they invented, and they market it to schools. And I asked him one day, because you notice it's not in the news anymore, but there was a real big scare fairly recently during Trump's first term, I guess 2018 maybe, about China stealing American quote unquote intellectual property. And I asked him about that, and I said, how would you feel if the Chinese were marketing your software and spreading it around, and you were getting no monetary benefit from it? And he told me he wouldn't really care, because what they were basically doing was spreading around a similar software. It wouldn't necessarily be his anymore, because he said, for one, they couldn't update it, so he could release an update and fix some bugs or whatever, and it would be a better software than they were selling. But he called it free marketing, basically. And I guess the point I'm trying to get at is the recent scare. I'm sure it's going to come back for the upcoming election. But the Chinese intellectual property scare is not that big of a deal. It's more of a scare tactic than anything else.
Right. And it's a lot of it is these different companies that want to maintain a monopoly on
Hmm.
their product, whether that be a physical object or some process or whatever. But yeah. So moving on, we've talked about why private property is justified and also what limits there are on them. So now we have to ask ourselves, why are they widespread? And in his article, Why Property Rights Are Indispensable, Rainer Falsnacht puts it this way. Through a bottom-up process, this institution came into being organically, as Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian School of Economics, puts it. It was not someone deciding top-down that we shall have property rights now. It came into being because people who accepted and protected property rights had an advantage over others, and those who adopted the same approach. And so those others adopted the same approach. The reason property rights have to be in place is scarcity. If the world was a utopia without any scarcity, private property would not be necessary. In such a world, there would be no conflict between people over goods and services. There would be no necessity of an economy at all, as there would be no reason to trade. You could just have whatever you want. But the real world is characterized by scarcity. In the real world, not all dreams come true, and human wishes stay fulfilled. And human wishes stay unfulfilled. Some people have certain desirable goods while others don't. And really diverting from my outline here, Cotton, have you ever talked to some of these communists that believe that scarcity is a product of capitalism?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember there was a meme going around in like the philosophy channels that was saying, Aristotle said time was XYZ, and then so and so said time was XYZ, and then Karl Marx said time was a tool by the capitalists to sell clocks. But yeah, I've heard that. Yeah.
Yeah, I've never understood that. I don't know. It seems so easily disprovable to me.
Well, I mean
But
that's what you say when you're blinded by an ideology. When you have like religious adherence to uh, a this may not be the best way to put it, but a religious adherence to a secular ideology. It, and you're just unquestioning about it, and that's the main thing. You're completely unquestioning about it. Whatever so and so says, whether that's Karl Marx or Lenin. I know a lot of communists say that wasn't real socialism, or like there's a popular communist philosopher right now, Slavoj Žižek, and just whatever he says is gospel. There's no question, and that's the problem.
yeah, I don't know if you've ever watched the movie. It's called Enemy at the Gates.
Oh yeah.
And there's one scene that always stood out to me, and it was near the end of the movie, and Jude Law's character, the protagonist of the movie, he's the Soviet sniper.
Yeah.
He's there, and he's in this standoff with the German sniper who's been going back and forth with him the whole time. And anyway, his friend throughout the movie, he's there and he's talking about how the Soviet Union had tried to create this egalitarian society where everyone was equal and no one had anything that anybody else, that no one had anything that nobody else couldn't have, right?
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say that, how foolish it was, and that there was always something to be jealous over, whether it was a smile or friendship or whatever, right? And like that scene always just kind of stood out to me, as pointing out just the ridiculousness of, to me, that points out the ridiculousness of scarcity, or of scarcity being non-existent, or being a construct.
Yeah, I remember Jordan Peterson once said that the main problem with socialism is that, because the main tagline is to each according to his need, from each according to his ability. He said the problem is that ability is finite, but needs aren't. You're never going to fulfill someone just with, what things devolve into in socialism, whether that be grain or shoes. You can't even enter into the equation like cupcakes or iPhones. But it's a foundational misunderstanding on our ability to harness things that are finite or scarce.
Right. And it's not like socialism could even provide the physical goods. Not only that, they're just completely, they leave human needs such as fulfillment and happiness out of the equation. You never hear that really talked about.
Yeah, I was reading an article the other day, or I think it was last night. I was reading an article about it might have been Hoppe, and I was reading the criticisms tab, and there was I don't think it was Hoppe, but it was one Austrian economist, and there was a criticism from Paul Krugman that said, this economist doesn't adhere to foundational economic formulas and graphs. And I mean, right, all right, okay. So Paul Krugman's the same guy that said, I think in 1998, he said, "Oh, by 2005, nobody's going to be using computers. Nobody's going to be using the internet. Nobody's going to care." So we ought to listen to that guy.
Yeah, and what are you calling foundational? And what do you do?
Something we came up with in the last 20 years. It's foundational.
Right, and what excuses do you make when your foundational model, your little economic model, experiences something like the 2008 crash? What excuses do you come up with for how that happened, right?
Yeah, Rothbard talks about that in For a New Liberty. In the business cycle chapter, he talks about how in the 70s they entered stagflation, where there was inflation and I guess just a stagnant economy, which according to the Keynesian model wasn't supposed to happen. It went against all of their formulas and all their graphs, and well, it happens. I mean, you can't forget that economics is largely a humanity and not a science.
Right.
But that's a soapbox for another day.
All right. Getting back to it. We read the Fastnacht quote, and so we understand that property rights really outcompeted the other systems in the marketplace of ideas. So next thing that we want to get into is we know that most private land today was not claimed from the state of nature through the legitimate method of finding a plot of land and improving it through labor, then passing it down through legitimate transfers of ownership. At some point, the property was transferred through conquest, whether that be foreign invasion or state-related methods. So, can current property titles be legitimate? We'll look at Mises and in Human Action. He states this: private property is a human device. It is not sacred. It came into existence in early ages of history when people, with their own power and by their own authority, appropriated to themselves what had previously not been anybody's property. Again and again, proprietors were robbed of their property by expropriation. The history of private property can be traced back to a point at which it originated out of acts that were certainly not legal. Virtually every owner is the direct or indirect legal successor of people who acquired ownership either by arbitrary appropriation of ownerless things or by violent spoliation of their predecessor. So Mises, he acknowledges that most private property, at some point, that initial legitimate claim was interrupted by a expropriation, a violent taking over of the property, right? In again, another Mises quote, he talks about the illegitimate transfers of property, and he states that it does not necessitate the abolition of private property. And he says this in his book, Socialism. When we follow the legal title back, we must necessarily arrive at a point where this title originated in the appropriation of goods accessible to all. Before that, we may encounter a forcible expropriation from a predecessor whose ownership we can in its turn trace to an earlier appropriation or robbery. That all rights derived from violence or all ownership from appropriation or robbery, we may freely admit to those who oppose ownership or on considerations of natural law. But this offers not the slightest proof that the abolition of ownership is necessary, advisable, or morally justified. Then in The Ethics of Liberty, Rothbard, I'm not going to read the quote here, but he acknowledges that not all property ownership is legitimate if it's acquired through illegitimate means, through theft of some kind. But he does argue that unless you can prove that the current owner somehow stole the land or the property, that unless you can prove it, then really he argues that you don't need to be you don't need to have the property revert to public property or something like that. In summary, while illegitimate property transfers should be rectified, one cannot use historical injustices to justify the abolition of property. In For a New Liberty, Rothbard talks about how liberals, and by liberals, remember that he's talking about leftists in general. It was 1973 when this book was published. He talks about how liberals support so-called human rights while rejecting property rights. He says they supported things like free speech, sexual freedom, drug use, etc. Basically, they believe that people had a right to do whatever they wished with their bodies, but they weren't on board with physical property outside of that. So he asks a few questions. Free speech. How can you have free speech if the government owns the media? How can you have free speech if the government owns the assembly halls? It's, pretty obvious problems that come up if you don't have private property and you're also trying to argue that the government's going to protect your rights if it owns all property. He also brings up the example of the Soviet Union. Obviously, they owned all of the means of production. And so he says, if the Orthodox Jews are wanting matzah for their religious purposes, can you really expect the atheist, godless state that the Soviet Union was to be producing matzah for them? That you can't expect religious freedom in that scenario. So anyway, I think, Cotton, you have a little bit to say about the natural order. And
Yeah, so we understand that property rights and private property is a foundational idea to libertarianism. But even if you aren't considering libertarianism or anarchism or whatever idea that we currently have, because these definitions change, we do have to realize at what cost, what the cost is, rather, when we divert from certain things. So I know I was acquainted with the natural order in Hayek's book, The Fatal Conceit. And Hayek was a completely secular atheist. He might have said he was agnostic, but he acted very atheistic. And in The Fatal Conceit, he was defending a lot of institutions that you wouldn't think of an atheist defending. Like, because I know when I think of atheists,
hey, Cotton, real
yeah.
quick, you may have to start over. What kind of mic are you using? It's like breaking up.
It's breaking up. I'm
Yeah.
using well.
Can you
I didn't change anything. Is it still breaking up?
Yeah, maybe if you unplugged it and plugged it back in.
All right. Is that better?
Yeah, it seems like it is better.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but I
Oh,
figured.
no, that's fine. So I was first acquainted with the natural order in Hayek's book, The Fatal Conceit, and he was defending a lot of institutions that you wouldn't expect an atheist, which he was, to defend. Number one was religion, and what he was basically saying was, you can call it nature. I mean, you could call it just a scientific law, or you can call it evolution, or you can call it just God's path to the most successful and happiest life. But there are certain systems that we have in our world that are the most conducive to a happy life. And it's not like we invented them. We did not invent private property. When John Locke wrote his second treatise of government, he did not invent private property.
Right.
You could say the first person that wrote about private property just discovered it. Or he was the first to hit the nail on the head when trying to investigate the best possible the best possible system of acting. But when you try to divert from that, there are dire consequences. and and that's what the fatal conceit is about. Uh, the fatal conceit is mainly intellectuals and professors trying to teach students that they can change nature.
Mm.
And my argument is that private property is part of nature. It is a foundational idea that we were lucky enough to discover, uh, or we were lucky enough to put it on such a high pedestal. Uh, that it's incredibly dangerous to throw out the window.
Right.
And this might be preaching to the choir a bit, but when you do throw it out the window, you get situations like Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia and any other communist government. There are plenty of them to pick from. But it's just an incredibly dangerous thing, and you're playing with fire, and there's no way for it to work out. It would be like um, it would be like trying to change the laws of physics. It's not going to work on Earth. I mean, uh, it just
Right.
it just doesn't work.
Yeah. The free market is one of the only systems that I know of that it takes one of the what is seen as maybe one of the negative aspects of human nature, which is selfishness, but what you could also call self-interest, and it harnesses that into a system in which people trade with each other in order to better their own position.
Yeah,
And
and trying to get rid of selfishness is a pipe dream. It's not going to happen.
right, it works with human nature
Yeah.
instead of some authoritarian system that has this idea of changing a fundamental part of human nature. and of course, in order to do that, they look to state authority and violence and all that. That's just doomed to failure.
Yeah, and I mean Bastiat wrote about it in I forget what it's called. I have the book right next to me, or a collection. Uh, that which is seen and that which is not seen, and Hazlitt wrote about it in Economics in One Lesson. When you try to tamper with these systems that are ingrained in nature, the wheels are going to come off of the wagon. It's it's really bad.
Yeah.
So I suppose that's what we have to say on private property, unless you have anything else to add.
Yeah. Basically, I just want to. I think we both thought it was a good idea to start or to have one of our first episodes be on private property because it's so important. It's a foundation of libertarianism, and then really all discussions on hot button topics. They're really the libertarian arguments are based in private property, and then secondarily through the NAP, the non-aggression principle, which itself is based off of private property and individual rights. So I hope that we did a good job with it, and that now people have a clearer picture of the arguments behind private property.
Yeah, and then on the show notes page for this episode, we will have all the a litany of articles that you can read, the ones we looked at and a couple extra, uh, to better acquaint yourself with what we use to get into this headspace. Um, well, on Twitter you can find me at Cottonarchist. Sorry.
And then for me, LibertyZero, you can find me at LibertyZero, with the O at the end being a actual zero.
All right. Well, thank you for listening.